All right, in the next section, we are going to complete paperwork that we have to get done. And it's going to start off with the Healthcare Hero Code on the top, as you can see on the screen. Anything that you sign is going to be put in one pile that will be collected at the end. Anything that you do not sign is going to be yours to take home. So the Healthcare Hero Code is just our promise to our coworkers and to our residents that we're going to do everything in our power to uphold the infection control measures, whether at home or in public. And if you have any questions that you're going to ask about the practices. It just states that we're going to do everything we can, protect our coworkers, our employees, and make reasonable decisions outside of work so that we're not putting anybody in excessive risk. And if you can just sign where it says employee name and title and today's date. On the next page, should say post-test, ethics, and compliance. If you could print your name and your job title and today's date. So who is the facility compliance liaison? Is it the administrator, the director of nursing, the regional vice president, or the regional nurse consultant? In pretty much any facility, the administrator is responsible for any compliance related issues, and they are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if there is one. Number 2, Code of Conduct is a guide to the behavior in the workplace, a means of communicating company expectations, an overview of selected company policies, or D, all of the above. The answer is D, all of the above. It gives you a snapshot of the company policies, something that is simple and easy to read to give you a gist of what the expectations are. Number 3, who is the compliance officer for the company? This one, I don't think I've seen it in the presentation, but it's the only one that has credentials at the end of their name, and that would be letter B, Hazel Mahoney. How can you report a concern? Can you talk to a supervisor or department head, to a compliance liaison or the compliance officer, to a hotline number, or all of the above? Answer, all of the above. All these numbers are posted. There should be some right when you walk in to the building, right behind the receptionist's office and by the time clock. Reports may be filed anonymously. True or false? That one is letter A, true. This helps prevent any retaliation in the workplace. Number 6, the hotline number is available on posters, on cards, from supervisors, or all of the above. And that would be all of the above. Number 7, is it okay to share passwords? True or false? That would be false. We don't want to leave anything open for somebody else to document under our name because we would ultimately be responsible for that. Number 8, it is okay to share patient information with family members just because they are family. True or false? That would be B, false. Just because they're family doesn't mean they're authorized to receive patient information. There may be an internal conflict. They may have issues with certain family members. So we always want to make sure they are on the list to receive patient information. Number 9, The monthly meeting is known as the QA&A Compliance Committee meeting. That one is letter A, true. That occurs at the end of each month. And number 10, QAPI is a component of the QA&A meeting. That is true. QAPI just stands for Quality Assurance and Process Improvement, and it's how we are proactive to address any potential problems with the facility and correct them before they become a bigger problem. And then if you could sign right where it says employee signature. And then flip to the next page. The next page that you see is going to be the statement document. This is our form to collect statements from any employees when there has been an incident, and a risk management issue, or something of note that we want to look into in the facility. So for example, if a resident had fallen, you may be asked to write a statement so the risk manager can review what had happened. This will include questions about how the resident was positioned, did they hit their head, what interventions were in place at the time of the fall, when's the last time we saw them, and all of this helps us drill down to the why of something happening. So why did that resident fall? Were they trying to go to the bathroom and they haven't been toileted in so long? Was it somebody that came into the facility, they were more lethargic, they didn't want to get up on admission, and now all of a sudden they started working with therapy, they have their energy back, and now they're trying to walk. It helps us, all these statements helps us identify what the root cause of that problem was, so we can apply an intervention to so that the incident does not happen again. Next page behind that is just the second part of the statement form. If there's any questions, something was unclear, you may be asked follow-up questions to expand upon your statement. And the rest is, the third page is the third page of the statement document for risk management, where we can note if anything could have been done differently and what we would have done to prevent the event from happening. Behind that sheet, on the next one, is going to be the policy and procedures for reporting suspected crimes. Now, we're not going to go over I'm not going to read through this entire page, but this is what governs how we treat pretty much allegations, suspected crimes, neglect, abuse, anything that could cause harm to the resident. And there are certain processes that we have to follow. So for the definitions, it's basically who is covered. Anybody that works in a long-term care facility, regardless of department, is covered under this policy. Could be a visitor, could be a contractor, a vendor. Everybody, we have an obligation to report a suspected crime. We report the suspected crime to your immediate supervisor and or the risk manager, the administrator, or the director of nursing. So once that report has been made to the supervisor, we have to decide whether it is if the event resulted in serious bodily injury or if it did not. And the reporting requirements are different. If there is serious bodily injury, it's 2 hours from the report of the suspicion. If it does not involve serious bodily injury, we have 24 hours to report from the note of the submission, of the suspicion. Don't take it upon yourself to determine which one it is. That is the administrator's job, since they are responsible for all of the abuse and reporting requirements. It's on them to determine whether it meets the 2-hour or the 24-hour criteria. So that would be 3 pages. And then the next one that you should see should be the Abuse Prevention Program. This goes over what is abuse. So abuse is a willful infliction of injury. Not necessarily that there's any intent behind it, but that as a result of your actions, we caused injury to somebody else. So for example, if we're lifting somebody up in a boosting somebody up in a bed, and we boost them too far, and they hit their head on the top of the bed, that could be considered abuse, depending on how the resident reports it. It doesn't mean that it was intent. It doesn't mean that we chose to cause injury. It's just that a result of our actions that it happened. It could be unreasonable confinement, involuntary seclusion. It could be separating the resident from other residents without good reason. Could be punishment with resulting physical harm or intimidation, threatening to withhold services. There's verbal abuse, which is oral, written, or gestured language. It could be derogatory terms to the residents or their families to describe the resident within their hearing distance, regardless of their ability to comprehend. So even if somebody wanted to cuss and the family overheard it, it could be considered abuse, or it could initiate an investigation of abuse, depending on how the family reports it. We can have physical abuse, which is you're hitting, slapping, punching, pitching, spitting, scratching, or holding roughly. It can be sexual abuse, which is not limited to humiliation, harassment, coercion, or sexual assault. It's considered non-consensual sexual contact of any type with a resident. It can also be considered, the humiliation part of it could be considered a form of sexual abuse where if you're cleaning a resident and they're exposed and you leave the door open so everybody walking by can see them, that can be considered a type of sexual abuse. Mental emotional abuse can also be humiliation, harassment, threats of punishment, or deprivation. That one can be more about using derogatory terms, demeaning the resident, talking down to them, anything that can make the resident feel bad about themselves. Then we have neglect, which is the failure to provide goods or services necessary to avoid physical harm, mental anguish, or mental illness. So a lot of times what you'll see is a resident that shows signs that they have not been cared for. So this could be when come in the morning and I walk into residence, they tell me they haven't been changed. And I look at the sheets and I can see that they're wet and part of it has been dried. And so there's a staining on the sheets. And then there's towels underneath, like somebody tried to clean up the bed but didn't finish the job. So there are signs that say that this could be neglect. We want people to report that so we can follow up and prevent that from happening. It can be exploitation, misappropriation of resident property, where you deliberately misplace, exploit, or wrongfully use a resident's own belongings for your benefit. can be an injury of unknown source. If any injury that looks suspicious, report it. It could be a bruise around somebody's forearm that looks like fingers. It could be a bruise in an area that the resident doesn't know how it happened, or an injury they don't know how happened. It can be bruising in areas where you don't expect a bruise to happen based on their condition. So if they're in bed and they have bruises on the inside of their thighs or or on their trunk, it's something that could be suspicious that we want to report so we can look into it. We also have to report suspected crimes. So a report from a resident or representative or other related that an event has occurred that may be deemed criminal by local law enforcement. Not necessarily just abuse, but any local crime. That we have an obligation to report it, not only to our supervisors, but we're also going to report it to the local authorities. So if there is, if a resident reports that somebody stole their belongings, we're going to report it to the local police. They're going to come in to take a statement and everything. All of this does not mean that something happened. What it means is that we have an obligation to start the process of investigation. From the results of that investigation will help determine whether an event actually happened or if it did not. The next page goes on about our screening for any abuse history with facility employees and the training that goes over with the Elder Justice Act and so on. When an investigation is initiated, event report is initiated, the administrator or the designee is notified and will initiate and conclude a complete and thorough investigation within a specified time frame, usually 3 to 7 days. It will include resident statements and interviews, employee statements and interviews, visitor statements and interviews as indicated, document review, chart review, policy review, looking through the education programs and appropriate resource review, and a reenactment of the event when indicated. What this allows us to do is to figure out what is happening, or what is the best explanation of events that has happened. And then on the following page, you will see the end of the abuse policy, and in bold right in the top there, about the immediate report filed with ACA. So when we note any suspicion of abuse or neglect or misappropriation or suspected crime, we want to make sure we're reporting it to the administrator immediately. His number is made available on all units in the assignment book binders, and he has 2 hours to report the allegation to ACA if they caused serious bodily injury, or 24 if they did not cause serious bodily injury. And again, let the administrator make that call. Don't take that upon yourself. The next sheet is going to be the abuse, neglect, and exploitation post-test. So if you can fill out your name, job title, and date. All right, with question number 1, who is the abuse officer in your facility? That would be the administrator. They can designate anybody else, but it will be the administrator for that. Number 2 is going to be a list of true or false questions. So we'll go through those. As healthcare workers, we are not obligated to report abuse unless we are certain that the abuse is legitimate. false. We have to report regardless. Letter B, if I did not hear the abuse or see the verbal abuse myself, I do not have to report it. That would be false. We still have to report it even if we did not witness it. A resident physically strikes at a nurse but misses, and the nurse calls him a name and then continues to work. This is not abuse. That would be false. It would still be considered verbal abuse. Letter D, the resident takes too long to eat and you have work to do, so you remove the tray. This is not abuse because they finished most of their food. False. We still have to give them time to eat and make their own schedule as well. Letter E, it is not considered misappropriation of resident property if I listen to my favorite radio station on the resident's radio as long as the resident is in the room with me. That would be false. If you're using any resident property for your own benefit, it's considered misappropriation of property. Letter F. It is okay if I wait for my next shift to report a resident concern as long as it is done within 24 hours. That is false. We want to report that immediately, and then it is the administrator's call whether it meets the 2-hour criteria or the 24-hour criteria. And you can call the administrator 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even at 2 o'clock in the morning. They will answer. They will be a little perturbed that they woke up in the morning, but happy that you called and let them know. Letter G. I overheard an abuse rumor in the break room, so I put my statement under the administrator's door, and I will follow up with my supervisor tomorrow. It is okay because I made the statement on the shift that I heard it. That is false. When you're reporting an abuse claim, we want to make sure we're calling the administrator, not texting, not slipping a note underneath their door, because we don't know when they're going to see it. For example, if the administrator catches COVID during the time that you slide that note under their door and the time they come in, they might not see it for 2 weeks or longer. Letter H. I can ignore a resident request if it is not part of my job. False. If the resident is asking you something you cannot do or it's outside of your scope, our job is to find somebody that can help that resident. So if they're asking a CNA for pain medication, we're going to let the nurse know. If they're asking for a new meal, obviously we don't have access to the kitchen, but we can let the kitchen staff know, hey, they need this. Or if they need the TV reprogrammed or they need remote, we're going to let the maintenance department know. Letter I. An alert and oriented resident cannot be subject to abuse because they are able to talk and communicate. False. Just because they're oriented doesn't mean they can't be subject to abuse. Letter J. Yelling or arguing with a resident can be considered abuse. That is true. Letter K. Referring to a resident using a nickname is okay as long as the resident says she does not mind. This one is false. The only time it is okay to use a nickname is when it is care planned. If it is not care planned, we cannot use that nickname. You can get into a situation where somebody that has dementia is okay with a nickname at one point, but then it becomes an issue later in the day. It can also be a family member may not be happy that you're using a nickname, even though the resident does not care, and it can initiate an allegation as well. Letter L. Making a resident do something he or she does not want to do is not abuse, as long as it is for his or her own good. That would be false. Letter M. It is okay to text the supervisor regarding abuse allegation between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. as long as you follow up later. This is false. When you're trying to report an abuse allegation, you're going to call the administrator and you're going to call them directly. And we're not going to text them because you're never sure when somebody's going to read the text or notice the text. But when you call them, you can tell if they're going to pick up the phone or not. Number 3. You overhear a staff member telling a resident that she is too big to be getting on and off the toilet and should just go on herself because she will get changed in a little while. Is this abuse? Yes, it is. And what would you do next? We're going to report it to the supervisor or the abuse coordinator. Number 4. You have a resident that frequently fabricates stories and has a history of making claims not always based in reality. She has told everyone she is going to get someone fired. Her family member comes to you and says, "Mom told me that last week someone punched her in the nose, but you know she can exaggerate sometimes." What would you do next? We're going to report it. Even if it is completely fabricated, we're still going to report it and we're still going to do an investigation. Number 5. At the beginning of your shift, you discover your resident is saturated and the sheets are not only urine soaked, but stained as well. He says he hasn't been changed since last night. Is this abuse or neglect? Yes, it is. And what would you do next? What we're going to do next is we're going to report it to the nurse and to the abuse coordinator, and we're going to clean up that resident. Number 6. A fellow staff member confides in you and tells you that a resident is scared of one of the nurses. The resident says that he does not want her to care for him anymore. What would you do next? We're going to report it. And for the CNAs, if it's your nurse that you're working with in your section and you don't feel comfortable going to that nurse, you can always come to one of the managers or the supervisors as well. Number 7. While providing incontinent care on your resident, you notice a bruise on the resident's arm and they don't remember how it occurred. What do you do next? We're going to report it. It could be somebody with dementia just bumped the doorway and didn't remember, but it also could be abuse. So that's why we want to report it so we can investigate and follow up. The next 2 pages are going to be listing residents' rights in the nursing home, which is some selected ones that they have, is the right to a dignified existence, the right to self-determination, the right to be fully informed of the care they are being provided, to raise grievances, the right to access to individual services, community members, and activities inside and outside of the facility and visitors of their choosing, rights regarding their financial affairs and how to manage their funds, the right to privacy, and the right to a safe discharge and transfer. And this is just for your information, so you can take these 2 sheets home. The next sheet behind that is going to be residents' rights post-test. You can fill out your name, your job title, and the date at the top. And this is going to be true and false for all questions. Residents' rights include the right to make choices. True. Letter B. If a resident's door is open and the resident is asleep, it is okay to just go in without knocking. False. We still have to knock and we have to give them the opportunity to respond to us, even if they cannot verbalize anything. Letter C. If a resident leaves personal mail opened on a bedside table, it is okay to read it without asking permission. False. They still have the right to privacy. Letter D. Residents have a right to have their own spending money. True, they do. Letter E. A resident cannot refuse to have certain treatments or refuse to take medication. False. A resident can refuse. Even if they are confused, they can still refuse medications and treatments. But it doesn't mean that we're just going to stop by just asking them. We're going to try to encourage them to make a good decision. Letter F. If a surveyor is in the building, the surveyor can ask a resident if their rights are being respected. True, and it's likely one of the first questions that they're going to ask. G. When you are giving personal care to residents, the following things are what you must do by law because they are the residents' rights. Introduce yourself before you start, pull the privacy curtain, and keep private parts covered. True. Letter H. When assisting a resident with care, it is a violation of privacy by knocking on the door and entering before they invite you in. True. Even if they cannot respond to us, we still have to knock, announce ourselves, and give them the opportunity to respond to us. Letter I. If a treatment must change because of a resident's changing condition, the resident does not need to know because it is ordered by the doctor. False. The resident always needs to know of changes, or their POA needs to know of any changes. Letter J. Residents have the right to keep and manage their own funds. True, they do. Letter K. It is okay to talk about residents' personal information with other residents, with relatives, and friends of a resident, with visitors, news media, or your own friends, as it is all public knowledge. False. Letter L. A resident may approve or refuse the release of their personal and clinical records to anyone outside of the facility, including family members. True. Letter M. You may continue cleaning a resident's room while they are on a private telephone conversation if you stay quiet and don't interrupt the conversation. False. They still have the right to privacy and they can have their private phone calls as well. Letter N. Residents have the right to refuse a doctored ordered diet. True, they do. Letter O. Residents can see any visitors they choose, even if a family member requests that you do not allow the visitor to see the resident. True, residents can make their own decisions. If a resident is incapacitated, that ability falls upon to the resident's power of attorney. The next page behind that is a copy of the Grievance Concern Report. This one is for you to take home. What we do is we fill out the top 2 sections of the Grievance Concern Report, and then it gets sent to social services. So in the receptionist's office up front, there's a mailbox that we can drop it in, and then social service will follow up from there. Behind that page is the policy and procedure for grievance and concern management. This goes over our policy with how we treat concerns and grievances and what the responsibilities are the different departments to follow up with the grievance and concerns. The next one that you'll see is the high risk and safety checklist. I want you to put that with the signed information, and I will take care of that later. All right, and the next one behind that, the high risk sheet, is the infection control post-test. Please fill out your name, your job title, and the date. Okay, number 1. What is a pathogen? Is it a deadly disease, a vaccine, a microorganism that can cause disease in humans, or all of the above? That would be letter C, a microorganism that can cause disease in humans. Which of the following are blood-borne diseases? Letter A, hepatitis B and HIV. Letter B, tuberculosis and the flu. Letter C, measles and mumps. Or letter D, all of the above. That would be letter A, hepatitis B and HIV. Number 3. Blood-borne pathogens can be transmitted by letter A, blood and blood products. Letter B, the air. Letter C, certain body fluids. Or letter D, A and C only. That would be letter D, A and C only. Number 4. PPE items include letter A, blood pressure cuffs and thermometers. Letter B, gloves, masks, eye protection, and plastic apron. Letter C, needles and other sharps. Letter D, none of the above. That would be letter B, gloves, masks, eye protection, and plastic aprons. Number 5. What is the number 1 line of defense against infection? A, regular hand hygiene. B, a yearly physical. C, vaccination. Or D, there is no defense against infection. Letter A, regular hand hygiene. Number 6. Examples of sharps include all except A, needles. B, scalpels. C, glass or hard plastics. Or letter D, IV tubing. That would be letter D, IV tubing. It's the only one that is a soft plastic. All right, and flip to the second page to see number 7. What is an example of an illness that requires droplet precautions? Letter A, influenza. Letter B, measles. Letter C, hepatitis. Or letter D, tuberculosis. That would be letter A, influenza. Measles is spread through skin-to-skin contact. Hepatitis is bloodborne. And tuberculosis is airborne. So number 8. What is an example of an illness that requires airborne precautions? Letter A, HIV. Letter B, the common cold. Letter C, tuberculosis. Or letter D, MRSA. And that would be C, tuberculosis. HIV is standard precautions, MRSA is contact precautions, and common cold does not have any precautions. We just use standard precautions as well. Number 9. Which of the following statements is accurate about standard precautions? Letter A. Standard precautions are based on the principle that all blood, body fluids, secretions, excretions, and non-intact skin are potentially infectious. Letter B. Standard precautions only include hand washing. If more precautions are needed, the appropriate transmission-based precaution should be implemented. Letter C. Standard precautions do not require the use of masks or face shields. Or letter D. Standard precautions are only for use with persons who have been identified as high risk for infection or who are currently infected. And that would be letter A. We're going to treat all body fluids, blood, secretions, excretions as they are potentially infectious for every resident. Number 10. Which link in the chain of infection do standard precautions break? Letter A, the reservoir. Letter B, the portal of entry. Letter C, the portal of exit. Letter D, the method of transmission. That would be letter D, the method of transmission. And then if you could sign at the bottom of the sheet where it says employee signature. Everything that you signed, put in a pile. We're going to collect that. Everything that you did not sign is for you to take home for your records. Thank you very much.